All right, so let's get into it today. We're tackling some pretty fascinating stuff, but gotta admit, it's a bit murky too. You know what I mean?
Murky's a good word.
You had a great question about a possible, hidden pact between Trump and Putin,
Huh.
especially with this whole war in Ukraine dragging on and these peace talks coming up.
Yeah, big question.
It's a hot topic, no doubt about it, and we're going to navigate it carefully.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to be using the ISW's, that's the Institute for the Study of War. Their latest assessment of the Russian offensive came out March 6th.
Solid source?
Yeah, they do good work. Now, we're not here to pick sides or, fuel any conspiracy theories. Nothing like that. Just going to lay out the facts, understand what's really going on.
Exactly. It's like a big geopolitical puzzle.
Right.
But some pieces are missing, right?
Oh, definitely missing.
So to even start putting it together, we got to look at Putin's recent behavior. I mean, he's completely rejecting any kind of concessions in peace talks.
Yeah, it seems like.
And just seems dead set on holding on to that Ukrainian territory that Russia already took, annexed.
Doubling down.
Yeah, he is.
He's making some pretty heavy historical comparisons too, right? Like comparing things now to Russia's unity back in World War I.
That's a big one.
What's the strategy there, you think? Is he trying to play the cornered underdog to get global sympathy? Or is this for real? Like he's actually ready for a long, brutal fight?
It's powerful for sure, especially for his audience back home. It brings up patriotism, that feeling of shared sacrifice, frames the whole conflict as, an existential threat to Russia itself.
Wow.
That kind of talk makes it so much harder for him to back down or compromise.
Even if it means like taking things way further.
Even if.
And in the meantime, the Kremlin's using that recent U.S. suspension of military aid like it's fuel for their propaganda machine.
Oh, absolutely. They're pushing this whole narrative of inevitable Russian victory, even bringing out guys like Major General Abdi al-Lodinov.
Isn't he known for some pretty,
shall we say, colorful pronouncements?
Colorful Lodinov.
He's bragging about a massive troop buildup and even going as far as threatening Europe.
So is all that just a bluff? Like to intimidate the West and make Ukraine's allies back off? Or does Russia actually think they've got the upper hand now that the U.S. is pulling back a bit? I mean, Alonov isn't exactly subtle, but his comments, they definitely raise the stakes.
It's really hard to say for sure what their actual assessment is, but it fits perfectly into this proxy war narrative they've been pushing.
Which brings us to...
Yeah, another interesting point. They're grabbing onto that statement from U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the one where he said this is a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia.
Right.
But they're twisting his words to fit their own agenda.
He probably meant it in the sense that, Russia is attacking a U.S. ally, but Russian media is spinning it like the U.S. is the one calling the shots.
Yeah.
Like we're the aggressors pulling strings behind the scenes and using Ukraine as a pawn.
Exactly. And that's dangerous because it shifts the blame away from Russia, right? Potentially undermines support for Ukraine both at home and abroad. It feeds into this idea that the U.S. made this whole thing happen. It's not an unprovoked invasion. Makes it harder to get global condemnation and support for sanctions.
Yeah, much harder. So speaking of finding some kind of solution, we've got these U.S.-Ukraine meetings coming up in Saudi Arabia to talk about potential peace talks.
Yeah.
But it sounds like everyone's showing up with completely different ideas about what peace even means. The U.S. has already rejected those 2022 Istanbul protocols that Russia seems so attached to.
Yeah, those Istanbul protocols were basically a non-starter for Ukraine and the West. And to really get why, we have to understand what Russia was asking for.
Okay, so what were they demanding?
Essentially, they wanted Ukraine to completely give up any hope of joining NATO.
Oh.
Drastically cut back its military. Become a neutral state basically under Russia's thumb.
So not exactly subtle.
No, not at all.
Pretty obvious poison pills there.
Yeah.
No one was going to agree to those terms. So that brings up the big question.
Yeah.
What does a more equitable framework for peace even look like?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
Any solution that actually works has to deal with the root causes of this whole mess. And it has to give both sides some security guarantees. Ukraine needs to feel confident about its sovereignty and its territory, their borders, and Russia needs to feel like their security concerns are being taken seriously.
That's a tall order, man.
Yeah.
Especially with how different their perspectives are and, that constant flood of misinformation and propaganda coming from the Kremlin.
You said it.
And then on top of all that, you've got the internal politics in Ukraine to think about. The ISW report highlights how Ukrainian opposition politicians are saying no to having elections before the war ends. They're saying it's unconstitutional under martial law.
Which makes sense.
But of course, the Kremlin's pushing for elections.
They are.
Hoping to get Zelensky out of there.
Eh,
It's a classic tactic.
right.
Stir up trouble inside, undermine the current leadership, and try to put in someone who's, more pro-Russia.
Someone they can control.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
really makes you wonder how much Russia actually cares about a democratic process in Ukraine. Are they just trying to manipulate things to get what they want?
It's a big question.
And amidst all of this chaos, we're seeing Europe still supporting Ukraine. Pretty strongly, too.
Yeah.
Even with the U.S. freezing aid, France and the Netherlands have announced new military aid packages.
It's huge.
France is even keeping up their intelligence sharing. And the Netherlands are funding those Ukrainian drones.
Interesting.
What does that tell us about Europe's long-term strategy? Are they just trying to keep Ukraine going? Or are they actively looking for ways to help Ukraine push back against Russia and get their land back?
It's got to be more than just basic humanitarian aid, right? Intelligence sharing, that means a deeper level of trust and cooperation. And funding drones, that shows they're willing to invest in things that could really shift the balance of power on the battlefield.
So what does this all add up to for the future of the war?
Yeah.
With Putin digging in his heels and the U.S. taking a step back, what role can Europe and the rest of the world play in finding some kind of peace in Ukraine? And what does all this mean for what happens next? What about those peace talks in Saudi Arabia?
Those talks are a real wild card, you know?
Yeah.
It's a chance for other players, especially in the Middle East, to step up and maybe be the ones who get things moving towards some kind of deal.
So another layer of complexity on top of everything else.
Exactly.
What's fascinating to me is we're seeing this shift in the whole global power dynamic.
Yeah.
And the outcome of this war, it's going to have huge consequences for everybody involved.
No doubt about it. Yeah, it really does feel like a high-stakes poker game right now. Everybody's trying to figure out each other's bluffs. But before we get too lost in those global, implications, let's bring it back to what a potential equitable framework for peace might actually look like. It's easy to throw around phrases like that, but what are the actual concrete steps that would need to be taken to get to something even remotely like lasting peace?
Yeah, because we've got those two positions that seem totally irreconcilable, right? The West sees Russia as the aggressor, the one who needs to back down, and Russia's claiming they're the victim of the West, encroaching on them and that they have legitimate security concerns. How do you bridge a gap that big?
It's a massive diplomatic challenge. There's no doubt about that. And any talk about equitable has to start with acknowledging, the elephant in the room, Russia's unprovoked invasion and all the suffering it's caused Ukraine. You can't have any kind of real justice without addressing those violations of international law and human rights.
But then there's Russia's point of view, however twisted it might seem. They're totally fixated on NATO expansion, convinced that if Ukraine joins, it would be an existential threat to them.
And that's where things get really, really tricky. Can you find a way to guarantee Ukraine's security and sovereignty without NATO membership? Could there be some kind of international agreement or framework that addresses Russia's security concerns, but doesn't mean sacrificing Ukraine's right to decide its own future?
It feels impossible, like trying to square a circle. You said earlier that any solution that's going to work would need to address the root causes of the conflict. What are those besides the obvious stuff, like the territorial disputes and the security concerns?
We have to factor in the information war that's been going on right alongside the actual fighting. Russia's poured a ton of resources into propaganda and disinformation, both inside and outside the country. It's created this echo chamber where their narrative is the only one that matters.
Which makes it even harder to have any kind of real dialogue, let alone find common ground for negotiations. It's like trying to talk to somebody who's convinced they're living in a different reality.
Exactly. And then to make things even more complicated, you've got people like Major General Alodinov, remember him?
Oh yeah, Mr. Colorful.
Spouting off about troop buildups and threats to Europe. Now we know he's a known propagandist, but what he says still reflects a larger trend within Russia's military and government.
What?
This growing sense of confidence, it's almost arrogance. Whether it's justified or not, they seem to believe they're winning this war, and they're not afraid to throw their weight around Alodinov's comments, even if they're exaggerated. They're meant to scare people. It's part of that psychological warfare we talked about.
Makes you wonder if they're really that confident, or if it's all just a front to hide their weaknesses and pressure Ukraine's allies to give up. Could that U.S. aid suspension be feeding into this narrative of Russian strength?
It's definitely possible. And that's where other actors like the European Union become even more important. We've already seen France and the Netherlands increasing their military aid. But the question is, can they keep that up? Can they fill the gap left by the U.S. and provide the kind of comprehensive support that Ukraine needs to stand up to Russia?
The ISW report mentioned France continuing to share intelligence and the Netherlands funding those Ukrainian drones. What does that tell us about their long-term strategy? Are they just trying to help Ukraine survive, or are they actually looking for ways to help Ukraine push back against Russia and take back the territory they've lost?
Tough to say for certain, but those actions do seem to indicate a commitment that goes beyond just basic aid. Intelligence sharing that suggests a deeper level of trust and cooperation, and funding drones that shows they're willing to invest in technology that could really change things on the battlefield.
But then you've got these peace talks happening in Saudi Arabia. It's a whole different ballgame, diplomatically speaking, with a bunch of new players and interests at the table. Could this be a chance for someone more neutral to step in and find a solution that works for both sides?
It's a possibility. The Middle East has its own complicated relationship with both Russia and the West. They might be able to find common ground where others have failed, or at least offer a new perspective that breaks through the gridlock.
But let's not forget about what's going on inside Ukraine itself. The ISW report mentioned Ukrainian opposition politicians saying they don't want elections before the war ends because of constitutional restrictions.
Yeah, that's a thorny issue. On one hand, democratic processes are crucial, especially during a crisis. But trying to have fair elections when a country's under attack, that's a huge challenge logistically and politically. And let's be real here, Russia's going to try to use this to interfere and manipulate things to get what they want.
Raises the question, are they truly interested in a democratic process in Ukraine, or are they just trying to install a puppet government that'll do whatever they say?
It's a cynical view, but history gives us plenty of reasons to be suspicious of Russia's motives. They've got a long track record of interfering in elections and propping up authoritarian leaders. It's all there in black and white.
So we've got this crazy mix of internal and external factors, a propaganda war that's twisting reality, and a potential shift in global power. It's a lot to process, and we're not even finished yet.
We still need to dig into some of the specific points the ISW report brings up, like the debate over elections in Ukraine and what the U.S. aid suspension will mean in the long run.
Okay, let's not lose sight of the forest for the trees. Before we get into the specifics, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What does all of this mean for Ukraine's future?
That's a question that's impossible to answer, for sure. There are so many variables: the military situation, the political will of everyone involved, the influence of other countries. What we can say is that the stakes are unbelievably high, and what happens in this conflict will have consequences that reach far beyond Ukraine. It's going to affect the whole world.
This has been really insightful, but I think we need to pause here for a second. When we come back, we'll get into some of those specific issues from the ISW report and try to answer that big question. What does the future hold for Ukraine? So we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive going through that ISW report on the Russian offensive and really getting into all the political maneuvering around the war in Ukraine. But there's that one question that keeps coming back. So the one you asked at the beginning, is there something more going on between Trump and Putin, like some kind of secret pact?
It's the elephant in the room, right? And while the ISW report doesn't give us any smoking gun, hard proof, there are definitely some interesting little clues in there that make you want to dig a little deeper.
Let's put on our detective hats for a minute. What are those clues and how do they fit into everything else we've talked about?
Well, you can't ignore Trump's constant praise for Putin. I mean, even when Putin's doing things that are clearly aggressive, war crimes even, it's a pattern that goes back years, and it's been like a propaganda goldmine for the Kremlin.
Yeah, they've used it to create division in the West, make it look like NATO is the bad guy, and justify what they're doing in Ukraine. It's like they're working from the same script.
And then you've got the timing of that U.S. aid suspension happen right when Russia was ramping up their propaganda and getting ready for those peace talks in Saudi Arabia. It's hard not to see that as a deliberate move to weaken Ukraine's position going into the talks and give Russia an advantage.
Yeah, it definitely raises some eyebrows about Trump's motives. Is he really looking out for U.S. interests, or is he playing some kind of game with Putin, maybe hoping for favors or deals down the road? We've seen him put his own interests ahead of national security before.
It's a troubling thought, and we can't just dismiss it as some crazy conspiracy theory. The pattern of behavior, the things he says, the timing of it all, it points to a potentially dangerous situation where Trump and Putin's interests are lining up.
But we got to be careful here. We're in the realm of speculation. Now, we don't have any hard proof of an actual agreement or a quid pro quo.
Right. We're not saying anybody committed treason or colluded or anything like that, but we can't be naive either. We have to look at the facts, connect the dots, and ask the hard questions, even if the answers make us uncomfortable.
And as always, we've got to watch out for misinformation and propaganda, especially in a situation this emotionally charged.
Exactly. Don't just believe everything you hear. Question everything. Dig a little deeper. Find different perspectives. That's the only way to form your own informed opinion and navigate this crazy situation.
So what does this mean for the future of the war? We've got Putin digging in his heels, Russia's propaganda machine going full blast, the U.S. stepping back, and this looming possibility of a Trump-Putin connection hanging over everything. What happens next?
It's impossible to say for sure, but I think the next few months are going to be crucial. Those peace talks in Saudi Arabia could change everything for better or worse.
And we can't forget the incredible resilience of the Ukrainian people. They've been through so much, but they're still fighting for their freedom and their future.
Their strength is amazing. It's a reminder that even when things are at their worst, hope can survive.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
The most important thing is to stay informed, stay involved, and keep asking those hard questions. The situation in Ukraine is far from over, and what happens there matters not just for Ukraine, but for the whole world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll definitely be keeping a close eye on this story, and we'll keep you updated as things develop.